So last week we kicked off a series called Unexpected. We're talking about some stuff that kind of sneaks up on us. But sometimes what keeps things from sneaking up on us is that we're so familiar with it. Like, let's just play a little bit of a game together, okay? Does that make sense? In 1983, a lady named Cyndi Lauper released a song all about what girls want to do, right? Now, you might be familiar with it. My guess is if I put the lyrics up here, girls just wanna, you would know the rest of it, right? Exactly. Have fun. Girls just wanna have fun. You remember the song, right? In 2008, Beyonce released a song particularly all about maybe a group of ladies that were not married. You might know them as the single ladies, right? All the single ladies was a big part of that song, and you might recognize one of the lines. If I put it up there, I'd say, if you liked it, then you shoulda, right, exactly, put a ring on it, right? You know, that was interesting. In 2003, a band named Fountains of Wayne released a song. Fountains of Wayne, some of you already know what this song is, right? This song was about a 12-year-old boy who knew a 12-year-old girl, and that 12-year-old girl had a mom that was questionable at the very least, right? She would apparently walk around in many stages of undress, and it was something that was like very tempting to him, and she didn't seem to mind letting him be around. And you might be familiar with it. Stacy's mom, you guessed it, is a pedophile, right? Exactly. You know, the truth is that is what happens to us. Things sneak up on us. But a little bit serious, a little more serious. How about this one? If I put this up here, would you know what it is? The definition of insanity is, right, exactly. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. This doesn't sneak up us anymore because we've heard it so many times. It's something that's familiar to us. Like if I were to say that hurt people, what happens? Hurt people hurt people. You know how that one goes. Even if you don't know this, that people say this, you know this because you've experienced it to be true. These things don't sneak up on us anymore because we've become accustomed to them. Because we've kind of gotten used to the sounds, we've used to the songs, we've used to the way it plays out, that we kind of know the end. And that same thing happens in the Bible, right? Because we establish some familiarity with a passage or with a verse or with a story that we kind of fast forward through it and we don't even listen. If I said David and Goliath, you're like, oh yeah, boy enters the scene, defeats Goliath, holds his head up at the end, we're done, right? You might listen passively, but it's pretty easy because you kind of know where it's going. It's like watching a TV show for the 10th or 15th time. You don't really have to pay attention anymore, even to experience it. I remember when the kids were growing up, we'd be on family vacation and we'd be driving, and my girls loved to watch National Treasure with Nicolas Cage. It's a great movie, anyways. And as kids, they watched it so much when we were in the car, I could hear it on the screen, playing on the DVD player out in the car, and I could listen and just see it in my head. I didn't need to see the pictures. I could experience it because it's so familiar, right? And what happens is that we become so familiar with stuff, especially Bible stories, that our familiarity mutes our expectations. And it's a big problem all the time because you've heard most of the Bible stories, you've heard most of the narratives at times. But during the regular parts of the year, we have 66 books written by 40 different authors that cover a span of 4,000 years of time. And so we've got quite a bit of room to run. But during a season of the year, like Christmas or like Easter, we don't have 66 books by 40 different authors written over 4,000 years. We have one story. And during Christmas, we unpack, as soon as I start saying it, right? We start talking about the shepherds in the field and watching over their sheep, and you're like, oh yeah, I know the rest of the story. I know about the wise men, I know about the traveling, I know about the no room at the inn, I know about this, I know about all that stuff, and I know that Mary and Joseph and them were in the stable, and then out comes the surprise ending, right? 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus, right? The truth of it is that it becomes kind of, typical for us. Something that's so profound, the God of heaven steps out of heaven and into our story. The way that 1 John puts it is that word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. That story of profound importance becomes kind of normal for us because we know how it plays out. We don't put ourselves in the story like we're experiencing it for the first time. Our familiarity kind of mutes our expectation of life-changing things. And the same thing's true of the Easter story. We get around Easter, like we're familiar with the cast of characters. We're familiar with all the stories. We know kind of how the thing works, right? And we know, and I don't mean to surprise you or, to spoil the ending for you. A little spoiler alert here. I don't know if you know this, but Jesus comes back from the dead at the end. And so we have a tendency to let our familiarity mute our expectations of what things. We become so familiar with the stories that we don't really hear anything. Now, to be honest with you, what I try to do to kind of upset my familiarity is I try to read things sometimes in a different translation. Like if I grew up hearing it one way, or I've memorized it in a certain translation, or I've spoken on it so many times that I'm just familiar with how it sounds, so I kind of passively read. I try to maybe read in a different translation. I'll pick up an older translation or a newer one and try and read it so it disrupts things. Some of those stories, though, are so familiar in all the translations because they're very simple stories. Luke chapter 22 is one of those stories where it's very familiar, right? And it's also very short. It doesn't have there's just not a massive amount of text to cover, but our familiarity and the brevity of it, right, shouldn't mute our expectations, because I think if we could just wake this passage up in our minds, or at least do this, wake our minds up to this passage, man, there's some stuff that really matters to us. Now, what we've got to do in this is that we've got to wake it up a little bit. But to do that, I thought, man, what we ought to do is we ought to kind of wake up our senses and do something totally different. So what I did was I took the passage and I went over to ChatGPT and I said, hey, ChatGPT, translate or just paraphrase this passage into Gen Z language. Now, before you get fired up and go, oh, you can't do that, you can do that, right? It's not maybe a great way to study the Bible, but it's not a bad way to understand it, right? All you do every single week when you walk in here, you sit down in a chair, you join us online, and what do? You listen to me paraphrase scripture in regular everyday language. So that's what this is doing. This is fun. Watch this. It says this: Judas, one of the crew, came rolling up with a squad, right? They were armed and ready to do some damage. Jesus was there, and Judas went in for the hug, trying to act all friendly, like he wasn't about to betray him. But Jesus knew exactly what's up. He asked him, bruh, are you gonna sell me out with a kiss? Seriously? Seeing what was going on, the other homies were with Jesus. Yo, should we bust out the swords and throw down? Then one of them said, we'll call him Pete. He grabbed his sword and sliced off the ear of the high priest's servant. But Jesus was like, hold up, fam. Enough with the violence. And he touched the dude's ear, healing him right then and there. And then Jesus said to the peeps who came to arrest him, why are you coming at me like I'm some sort of criminal? He said, I've been straight up preaching in public. I'm not hiding in some shady spot. But you know what? This is your time now. That's when the time when the darkness calls the shots. And with that, they took Jesus away. Now listen, like that is, Luke 22, 47 to 53, sort of, right? It's not out of a translation. It's just paraphrased for us in kind of that Gen Z language. You know what it does, though? It wakes up our senses. We kind of start going, oh, well, I don't know what to expect, so I listen a little closer. I don't know when the next line that's going to be funny is, or I'm going to have to figure out what the next word means. All that kind of stuff gets thrown in there. The unfamiliarity unmutes our expectation, right? We're allowed to hear all of our what's going to happen next, because we're not familiar with it. And that is one of the things that we're trying to help us do in this series, is kind of expect the unexpected. It's those things that sneak up on us. If you're a boxing fan, they call it the left hook. The left hook is that punch that somebody throws that you just didn't see coming at all. Like you'd see a right hook, you'd see a jab, but that left hook takes effort and time and work to execute well. And it's that left hook that comes and gets you because you're not ready for it. So what is it that just sneaks up on us, that are these unexpected moments in the stories that we're so used to hearing that we no longer expect things from them? But to be able to get that, I need to explain something to you that is a little bit technical. Now, if you're here today and you're like, man, I don't know much about the Bible, so I'm a little intimidated about Bible conversations. Maybe you're freaked out about talking to somebody about the Bible because you're like, I don't know enough to talk about, right? This will help you because we're going to talk about some stuff that matters to you and to me and to us and to like knowing something about the Bible. Or maybe you're here and you're like, I've got some real logical concerns about the Bible. I don't understand it. Maybe you're kind of holding Jesus and God and faith and church at arm's length because you've got some kind of logical questions about who Jesus is and how does it really work and that kind of stuff. Can we just talk about some important stuff that happens? Now, if you're familiar at the very beginning of the New Testament, there are 4 books. You can probably name them. It's kind of like what I said earlier. It's Matthew and Mark, and you'd go, oh yeah, Luke and John, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are what we call the Gospels. The Gospels are just really pictures, or they're stories that each of those authors that wrote those different books, they see things from their own perspective. Then we have like 3 of those are very similar. John is not similar. It's like more than 50% different than the other ones. He saw things and wrote things differently. He wrote it almost 70 years later. Okay, but Matthew and Mark and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. I know this is going to get a little technical, and if you're a little bit of a Bible nerd like I am, this is fun. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels, and what the Synoptic Gospels are a unique part of the Gospels. The Gospels are all 4 just different perspectives on the life and ministry of Jesus. They told the story from their perspective. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar. They're called synoptic because they're seen, or synoptic. They're seen the similar or seen together. And so here's the thing that's interesting about it, is it produces this thing. Now this is, again, going to be a little bit technical, but check into this because this will help with some of those tensions, right? It presents this problem. It's called the synoptic problem. And the questions are this, right? If there are really 4 independent accounts, right, then why are they so similar? And then this other question or this other problem, if they all saw the same things, then why are they so different? They call that the synoptic problem because the Gospels are 4 different accounts of the same instance. And can I just say this? There is both similarities and there's some differences. So what's the similarities and the differences about? If you asked a police officer, right, if you asked a buddy or somebody, one of the many police officers go here journey, and they said they were investigating something, and they went into, like they saw there was a robbery that happened, and they went in and interviewed 3 different witnesses, and those witnesses all used the exact same words. They all saw the exact same thing. You know what they would do? They would assume something, wouldn't they? They would rightly assume that if they all said the exact same thing, that those witnesses got together and worked their story out before you got there, right? Because the fact that they didn't see anything different or remember anything different means that they've somehow worked it out or coordinated it. So one of the reasons why we can believe that the Bible is true, why we can believe the Gospels are dependable, is because they are similar, but they're not exactly the same. It shows that they're independently written because they didn't work out their stories and decide to tell it the same way. They're different because they're individually seen. They're just seen differently. Let me just illustrate it this way. I got my phone and my iPad here, okay? Now, if I stood this iPad up like this, and I put my phone right here behind it, right? The people that are over here could see that I've got a phone right here, right? But the people who are here in the front would only see an iPad. If I said to them, what do you guys see? They'd say, I see an iPad, right? And the people over here would say, oh, I see a phone and an iPad, because they have a different perspective. But some of us that are listening close, right? We can see that I put it together. You saw the phone and the iPad, you know the whole story because you saw the construction of it. And that's what we do. When we put those 4 gospel accounts, those 4 different credible perspectives, we put them together, what we wind up with is the whole story. We get what each one of them saw and what each one of them thought was important and how they said it, and we can marry those together and see that this is a dependable account from 4 different people who saw different things and noticed different stuff. It's part of what gives us the potential or the ability to say that it's so powerful and useful to us. So we're going to pick up that same story we just heard. We're going to pick it up in the Gospel of John. It's John's account, and it starts off by saying this. After saying these things, Jesus just got to a point where he's like done at the Last Supper, and he says he crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples and entered a grove of olive trees. Now, John points this out, and nobody else points that out. It's important to John because he gets this bigger picture. John sees that this Kidron Valley and the locations of it are very important. He points out exactly where they're at because, like, look, he's not saying, hey, this is some valley, some garden somewhere. He's like, hey, they were in this very specific place. Because John was going, hey, I'm not remembering a general idea. I'm remembering an exact location. They went to the Kidron Valley. You know what's interesting about the Kidron Valley is that when David was running from his son Absalom, and when Absalom was trying to kill David, that David ran through the Kidron Valley and into this very same garden area to save his life. He hid there in the same place that Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley and went into this garden tomb, not into this garden area, not to save his life, but to save our lives. And that matters, right? That Jesus chose to be a part of this story that he steps into. In fact, the next couple of verses says it this way. Judas, the betrayer, knew this place. They'd been there a bunch of times. It was a common place. It was in a gated area, and there was a place that Jesus had a way to get into. He had a key to get into this part of this garden. He'd been there many times because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. That's, by the way, just a lot of people, right? Minimum of 200, maybe as many as 600 or 800, but a minimum of 200 soldiers and temple guard. The palace guard would have been a significant amount of people, but they give them a contingent, a chunk, right, of people to go along with them. And now, with blazing torches and lanterns and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove. They came to this place in the Garden of Gethsemane where they were coming up on Jesus. And Judas knew he was going to be there. The disciples knew exactly where it was. John points it all out. And then the next part of it happens. It's pretty profound. Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him. He knew the whole story. He wasn't surprised by the guards showing up. He wasn't surprised when he got arrested. It wasn't unexpected for him to experience the flogging or the betrayals. It wasn't unexpected, any of it. He fully knew every bit of it that was going on. And he says this to him. Who are you looking for? He asked. Look what it says. Jesus the Nazarene, they replied. And the English translation says, I am he. It's kind of unfortunate that we put he in there, to be honest with you, because the original language doesn't say I am he. The original language says I am. Jesus doesn't just say I am he. If you've ever read the Bible or been around the Bible, you know that I am is God's way of referring to himself. And so when Jesus said, who are you looking for? They said, Jesus the Nazarene. He said, I am. I am shows up on the scene. And what that reminds us is Jesus fully knew what was going on, right? He knew it was happening. And so he stepped into it. He asked them, he invited them in and said, look, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of the Nazarene. He's like, that's me. I am. I am the I am, right? And what that helps us understand is this is so important for you and I to know is that nobody took Jesus' life. He gave it. Nobody took Jesus' life from him. Nobody came in and snuck up on him or arrested him that he didn't fully comply to. I mean, he says it in that when we were talking earlier. He's like, I haven't been, hiding out in some shady spot, right? I've been preaching in public, yo. He's been all out in the open because he knew exactly what this was planned for. In fact, the night before that he'd gone into the garden and tried to pray, and you see his full humanity. He's praying, going, God, if there's any way to let this cup pass from me, please do, right? But nobody took Jesus' life from him. Nobody arrested him that he didn't plan to be arrested by. Nobody beat him that he didn't plan to be beaten by. Nobody crucified him that he didn't plan to be crucified by, because his life wasn't taken from him. his life was given for us. Man, sometimes when we get into the Easter story, doesn't it get to the point where it kind of gets a little muted for us? Like we're like, oh yeah, it's kind of for us. It's kind of like, feels a little bit like kindergarten graduation. You're so special, but then it's so is everybody else so special? And if you're special and everybody else is special, then nobody's really special. And knowing that God gave his life for you and for the person next to you and the person down the row. But it's so easy for us sometimes to, our familiarity with the love of God mutes our expectations and our memories that God didn't have his life taken from him, that Jesus gave his life for me because I sinned, because I walked away, because I'm like Judas, because I'm the betrayer. I'm the person who walks in. And that's really what happens next in the story. I mean, it says this, the traitor, Judas, that's a rough way that Matthew decides to talk about him. Matthew's not a fan. Matthew was a tax collector. Can we remember that part? That Matthew was a tax collector. He was the one that was hated. He was the one that was known as a thief. And so for Judas to be given the bags of money and the person to take care of that stuff and then to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, Matthew was like, that's ridiculous, that's heinous. And so he refers to him as the traitor Judas. Had given the pre-prepared signal, the prearranged signal. He says, you know which one to arrest when I greet him with a kiss. So Jesus says this, who are you coming after? And I am. And he goes to clarify or to confirm this. Judas steps in and he says, greetings, Rabbi, he exclaimed. And he gave him a kiss. And Jesus said, my friend, go ahead and do what you came to do, right? Do what you came here for. What catches my attention are these two words, the traitor Judas up here on the top and my friend down here on the bottom. You see, Matthew saw Judas as a traitor. You know, it's easy to do, is that Matthew forgot that at one time in the story, he was a traitor. It's so easy to do, isn't it? Our familiarity with God's love for us helps us to kind of forget where we came from. He sees him as the traitor Judas, but Jesus looks right in the eyes of the person that is betraying him with a kiss. And he knows exactly, remember what John said. John said he knew exactly what he was getting into. He knew everything that was going on. But he looks into Judas' eyes and he refers to him as my friend. And this isn't some snide my friend, by the way. This isn't him going, my friend, right? It's not him asking a question. He's saying, my friend, do what you came here to do, right? He refers to him and cares for him even in his rebellion. And I want us to know something. I mean, sometimes our familiarity with the story mutes our expectations that it really is about. It mutes our memory too, doesn't it? It mutes our ability to remember that this is true of us too. Just like Matthew forgot that Matthew forgot that he was a traitor too. It's easy for us to forget anyways, right? That even betrayal, we are still a friend of Jesus. Like even when you and I are in the act of walking away, he still loves us. Even when you and I are literally in the middle of our betrayal, we're literally spitting in the face of our Savior, he calls us friend. And Paul said it this way in Romans 5:8. He said that God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were still sinning, Christ died for us. In the middle of our rebellion, in the middle of our betrayal, every single time that we lean in to kiss the face of our Savior, to betray him for some reason of convenience or for some reason of lust or some reason of thing, every time we push away, he pulls us in close for a hug. The most intimate betrayal, the kiss. The most unbelievable expression of love, friendship, and laying down his life for another. That's what Jesus said, right? That greater love has no man than he lays down his life for his friend. That's a big deal. The story goes on a little bit, and I got to be honest with you, this part unfolds to my favorite part. Okay, my favorite part of this story is the response that Luke records. Now, several of them record this part of it because it's a pretty, in fact, all four of them record this interchange, but only one of them gets the biggest picture of it. It says, when the other disciples saw what was about to happen, they exclaimed, "Lord, should we fight?" We brought the swords, and one of them struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his right ear. Now, you gotta just get this picture, okay? There are 10 disciples and Jesus, because Judas is doing his thing, right? So there's 10 disciples and Jesus, and they're all together. It says all of them, they exclaim, "Hey, Lord, we should fight. We brought the swords. Hey, I got this thing. I got my knife. Don't worry, I'm carrying," right? I'm packing, that kind of stuff, right? There's a bunch of rednecks involved in this story, right? And so they're like, "Hey, we got this covered. Should we throw down," right? And before Jesus gets a word out, does anything, one of them, it just says one of them, struck the high priest slave, slashing off his right ear. Now we know from John's account that one is Peter, right? But it just says this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it just says one of the disciples. Now we'll talk about why that is in a minute, but my favorite disciple is Peter. In 1989, I saw a Christian concert. It was the day I gave my life to Jesus. And this long-haired dude stood up in front of everybody, and he said to this crowd of teenagers, he said, "Listen, of all the disciples, Peter is my favorite." I was interested in that. But his next words were, "I love Peter because Peter is a bonehead." And I'm like, you can't call one of the disciples a bonehead. That's not how you do it, right? My worlds collided. My kind of rebellious, live in my own kind of figure it out world and my religious world just kind of ran into each other. And I all of a sudden said, I'm like, you can't call Peter a bonehead because he's a disciple and the disciples are special. They're like superstars. And that's not true. What he was pointing out to us is that Peter, just like the rest of the disciples, were just regular guys. Regular guys with doubts and problems and regular guys who do stupid things. Peter's constantly running off at the mouth, saying things that he regrets or doing something like this, while everybody else is asking, "Hey, should we fight the 200 plus guys with our little band of 10? Hey, we brought the swords." Peter's like, "I ain't asking questions, bro. I got this. It's on like Donkey Kong." And he pulls out the sword and cuts off one of the dude's ears. He's like, "Let's go. Bring it," you know? Because here's the thing. Peter isn't thinking. What happens next is, and this is what I'm saying, like the Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't say who. They just say one of the disciples, one of them. They're real vague about it because of one truth, that what Peter just did was a capital offense. What Peter just did is a big deal. Now, John records Peter's name. He says, Peter did this. Why did he do that? Sorry, I got the cough. Why did he do that? He did it because John wrote his gospel after Peter was already dead. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote it before Peter was killed. And so here's the deal. If they said, "Hey, Peter struck one of the disciples, one of them, and cut off his ears," this is an eyewitness account that could be held against Peter. So the tension had died down because Peter had died when John wrote his gospel. When John wrote the story, the evidence didn't really matter anymore. And what happens next, this is why Luke records it. Luke says this, "But Jesus said, 'No more of this.' And he touched the man's ear and healed him." Now you got to imagine the tension that was in that moment, can't you? I mean, why is it that Jesus does this? I mean, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't record exactly who it was. John says, "Hey, Peter's already dead, so there's nothing that can be held against him," right? And Luke records this. Luke's a physician, by the way, he's a doctor. And so he kind of gets this part of it, the healing part of it, and he touched him. Can I just point this out? This is the very last of Jesus' miracles. The first one, he turns water into wine. The last one, he heals this man's ear. And I mean, not counting the fact that he raised from the dead, but the last of his miracles on earth is healing this one thing. And here's what's crazy about it. It's no different than what he'd been doing. Even the night before, Jesus had told everybody, "This is what's going to happen. My life's going to be given. One of you is going to betray me. You're going to sell me out. I'm going to be arrested." But he said, like, "No, that this is what's happening." And what was crazy about it is this moment He wasn't doing anything new. He didn't bend over and reattach that ear because he wanted a chance to look at Peter and kind of go, come on, Peter. He didn't bend over and pick up that ear and reattach it to that man's head because he's like, hey, one last party trick. Let me just do a grand finale, right? And that's not what he was doing. He did that because here's the truth, is that there's the left hook that comes out of nowhere. There's no evidence in the court if there's no ear on the ground. There was nothing that could be held against Peter if Jesus were to take his ear and reattach it to his head. What are you going to go? Go back and say, hey, he cut my ear off. Well, then he healed it, right? But he cut it off. That guy cut it off, but then that Jesus guy, they would be like, no, you can't do that because we're trying to crucify Jesus. We're trying to get rid of him. And here's what's so crazy about it is this is not new. Jesus wasn't up to a new thing going, hey, I got to get my friend Peter off of this charge. What he was doing in giving his life, not having it taken from him, was that he was erasing the evidence that you and I have ever sinned. It goes to the same place where David went to save himself. He goes there to save us. It's the same thing. He invites us in as friends even though we're betraying. And he heals this ear to take away the evidence so there's no way to charge Peter. And it's exactly what he did on the cross. He gave his life to erase the evidence of our rebellion. Scripture says really clearly that all of us have sinned. We've all walked away. We've all pushed away from God. And that the cost or the penalty of that sin is death. And that we are forever separated from God because of the evidence of our sin. But Jesus gave his life so that you and I could have the full and rich and satisfying life that he offers when he wants to live life with us. Man, if you're here today in this room or online and you're thinking through this, you're like, I've really never given my life to Jesus. It's kind of like what Chris said last week. Maybe you're at this place in your life where you've accepted him one day as Savior, but you've never really given him your life as Lord. But man, maybe Jesus isn't looking for you as a follower, as a fan. He's looking for you as a follower. Maybe today you say, you know what? You, Jesus, gave your life so that I could have life. You gave your life so that there was no evidence of my rebellion. There's no evidence in the court if there's no ear on the ground. There's nothing to hold against me. That yes, there are parts of my story that I wish I could change and do over. There are parts I wish I could edit or delete. There are parts I wish I could select and forget they ever happened, right? But God doesn't hold those against me because there's no evidence. Jesus gave his life so that I could have life. That's a left hook. That's unexpected. That's powerful.